But the fact that like I felt like as a citizen, you were reaching for your gun to try and intimidate me to enter my house where it's 4-on-1, that was some of the things.
The sharp division of people into two main groups.
I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves.
I said, please don't be too nice.
Said, harassment, I'll show you harassment.
This is your police department in review.
We cannot settle for anything less than transformative structural change.
I would say for me, one of the things I've realized is that in America, I really grew into being an African American. What I mean by that is my family is actually, like my name's Henry Johnson, doesn't sound very African. My great-grandfather, so in 1878, my great-grandfather who had been a slave, earned his freedom, fought in the Civil War, went through Reconstruction, and then due to the rise of the KKK and lynching, was like, you know what, this American thing ain't working out, you know? So he literally sold everything, got on a ship with his family, and sailed for Monrovia, Liberia. When he landed in Liberia, one of the fascinating things is that we're all products of our environment, and what the slaves had learned in the South is essentially what we kind of reformulated in Liberia, except we elevated ourselves to a higher class and instituted a system that literally put barriers on indigenous Africans or indigenous Liberians at the time. And what's crazy about, or even wilder about the whole situation is that, you know, we only came over on a couple ships. I mean, yeah, we had consistent people coming over, but after 5, 10, 15, 100 years, there's a lot of intermarriage, right? So part of the system in Czech was having sons, because your sons kept your last name. You know, so if I look at my immediate heritage, you know, I would identify as an Americo-Liberian. However, I have one grandfather who was a Vai Muslim chief. You know, I have another grandfather who's Grebo, which are just tribes in Liberia. However, because of Johnson, I get called Americo-Liberian. So I say all that to say I come from a place of privilege in Liberia, a privilege that was challenged in 1980 when the patriarch of our family was president and assassinated. And that started kind of a series of, not necessarily we lost all of our privilege, we just lost our political power. But if you're part of a system that owns everything in the country, you don't necessarily lose your power either. So when the Civil War came in 1989, I got the experience as a refugee and an immigrant being in another country and all the emotions that comes from natives. Most of the countries we were in was welcoming, but you still face that as a kid, right? So I come from a kid who grew up in a system where like I had my own personal butler to now being in an immigrant camp, to now being in a refugee camp. But even then we were all African and we were all West African and we were all black, right? But even more fascinating is, I think a lot of people forget this, but Africa is basically a bunch of, I call it arbitrary lines. You know, we just call them countries on maps, right? So one of the privileges I had was we had family in other countries, which sounds crazy, except if you think like, oh, I have family in New Jersey, I have family in New York. Like that's not that wild. And some of these countries are closer to us than New York and New Jersey. And that was a privilege because when the war came, you know, essentially we would go, we got to drive out of our country, which is a privilege, right? Because my grandmother would say who she is and she would get pushed through. And even if we spent a day or two in a refugee camp, it was almost like watching a movie or a TV show when you get one phone call. And essentially she would get one phone call and somebody would come and get us, you know? And part of that was she comes from a system where her family was in power. Like, I mean, my grandmother's brother was the president who was assassinated in 1980. So there's also not just familial ties, but political ties, right? So at 6, 7, I'm not recognizing all this privilege. I would say becoming African American for me is when you come to America, you're black. You know, like America doesn't care what kind of black you are necessarily. It might be cool for like a dinner party, but essentially you're black. And I remember, you know, I had been a refugee and an immigrant in Sierra Leone, in Ivory Coast. And in each of those places, you know, my parents very much valued education. My mom claims at 3 I was reading. You know, I have a 4-year-old, so I don't even know how that's possible. But apparently that's what's the case. So I'd always done well academically, mostly because my mom's an educator too. So it's like, even when we were in these camps, I was getting education, right? Because she valued it and thought that was a possible way out. Well, when I came to the States, one of the things that was kind of wild to me was I got put in a learning support classroom without any testing, you know, and I remember just this situation where I couldn't, you know, I had family back home who were saying like, why aren't you getting tested? You know, like, this doesn't make any sense. Why would they put you in that classroom? I had family here who was saying, well, I mean, this is America, it's different, you got to trust the system and blah, blah, blah. But for me, that was my introduction, that like my skin color alone, you know, could put me in a certain class, right? And this is in North Jersey, you know, this is not in like the Jim Crow South. This is North Jersey that would consider itself a liberal beacon, especially on education, right? But looking back, I'm grateful for that experience because I think that was also my eye opener to realize like, oh my goodness, there's people society leaves behind. So anyway, that experience was very, very helpful for me because middle school is brutal. For many different reasons. It's extra brutal when you're in a learning support classroom. Now, I had a cousin, you know, I had friends who played sports, right? I played sports with. So it was like, I played sports, that was my way out, you know? I wasn't learning support, so I would do my work. In a weird way, that was my easiest assimilation to America, you know, because like, I would do my schoolwork in 10 minutes, maybe 5, and I had the whole school day. So one of the things my teacher, Mrs. Petruzzelli, who I still remember, I reconnected with her a couple years ago, so I was like, thanks for valuing me, you know, like she's just like, oh my gosh, this is crazy because it's been like 20, 30 years at that point. And I was like, no, seriously, thanks for valuing me. Now, she also cursed me because she made me a Mets fan, you know, like her and my best friend at the time, Jimmy Russo, were huge Mets fans. So kind of wish she didn't give me that blessing. But at the same time, like she used me as her teacher's aide, essentially. Like, I went around helping other kids do their homework. I started playing sports and my circle of friends got bigger. So I'd come back on Monday and be like, hey, I didn't see you at the party. And they go, oh, I wasn't invited. I was like, oh, that's tricky. Or I played sports. I'm like, how come you're not on the sports team? It's like, oh, that's tricky. But then, so I would say that was probably my first experience of racism. Like, now I also was in a town that had maybe 2 black families. So there was other stuff, you know, playing sports are like, oh, here comes their black kids. They must be good. And I was like, well, yeah, I'm good. But is it because I'm black or is it because I'm good? Like, it was like, as a 9-year-old, you're processing all this stuff and you don't necessarily have the name of it, right? And then the other thing that was kind of fascinating is, so at the end of 5th grade, we had standardized testing. And I think that like, I placed in the top 30 in the school. So literally I had 5th grade that was generally a joke. Like in the sense of like, I just did worksheets in 5 minutes and that was like my work. And most of my teaching was in teaching other kids stuff, you know? And then I placed in this class. So I go from that setting to now mentally gifted and actually not just having homework, but like getting the hardest stuff in the school after all this transition I've been going through in these other countries. And I never necessarily got an apology from the school. I never necessarily got like, hey, we're sorry we put you there. We didn't test you before. It was just more like, oh, the system corrected itself. You know, it was more like, see, we found you out anyway. This worked out, you know. But I said, I think I have a more, not necessarily nuanced position, but I see how God moved even in that, right? Because I think if I had come in where I was able to be an athlete and an academic, like, I don't think I would be able to see people as I do now. You know, I think that 5th grade experience was really, really helpful because I'm like, oh, there's people we leave behind, right? So I think that was formative. Another maybe touching point is, you know, after a couple years, it was just hard. I mean, one of the reasons, we went to a pretty conservative church, but one of the reasons we went there was because it was the first place that we felt loved. You know, it's one thing to be an immigrant and refugee, but it's like, if that's all I am to you, I'm never your brother or sister, right? So it was fascinating because we'd have like a Liberian or an African church, and then I don't know how familiar we are with Plymouth Brethren, but it's a very different than an African church. Whatever you picture an African church is, this is the exact opposite, right? In North Jersey. So we had an opportunity to move to Philadelphia, and we were stoked. You know, we're like, oh my gosh, like, everyone's black there. This will be great. You know, we can't wait. Black people, you know? And when we moved to Philadelphia, that was another education on many levels. One of the levels was like, oh, you're black, but you're African. You know? So even within my own community, I think that's when we really started downplaying our Africanness. You know? So for me, like even like in a white town, your Africanness was like what's the word I'm looking for? It was like a novelty. It wasn't necessarily enough to value you, but I was like, oh, that's a different story, you know? But I didn't even have that, right? Among my own people. So that was another thing where then I had to do this work of like, oh no, now I'm black. You know, now I'm African American. You know, now it's like, not necessarily I lost my Liberian heritage because I still ate my food. You know, I still like that. My primary culture at home was Liberian, but like as soon as I left the house, I was African American, right? And it was this assimilation thing that I was trying to do. But then I started seeing more systemic stuff, so it wasn't just personal now. You know, I started seeing kids in my neighborhood who I grew up with who were smarter than me. You know, like brilliant, and they just had no concept of like or want or desired that college was an option. Whereas in my family, like what grad school are you going to? That's where we start talking. Like, it's like your undergrad is basically like figuring yourself out. That's your 4 years to find yourself, So that was new to me, right? And then seeing barriers in place. I tell a story about I went to Messiah College, and my freshman year, we went home for fall break, and so people are like, oh, it's your first time home, how was it? Like, oh, I finally did laundry, or I was good to see my family again. It's like, what did you do? And my fall break, I actually went home and I had to bury 2 people. One of the kids, whose name I won't say, is someone I grew up with, who was on the block behind me. He was brilliant, he's one of those kids where it's like, if he had not necessarily just mentoring, but it's like if he had opportunities, like I'm 37, like he could be running a Fortune 500 company. Essentially, he made some bad steps, but part of it was he realized like there's no way out for me. And the only way out I see is doing something illegal. And at 16, 17, he organized this network, which is just, it's wild, like the stuff he was doing, right? It was very, very illegal. But the fact is he realized that if I'm selling drugs, for example, there's only like a certain level I will rise to, and I will always be behind these guys who've been here longer or who have more power, right? So he basically, I always say, like, I use business terms, he basically assessed the market and realized there's no growth capital there. So he found another instance that was still illegal where he found a greater, I would say, capital growth or possibility for growth, and he basically cornered it in my neighborhood. And at 17, he had all these rival factions who were literally depending on him for whatever he was providing, right? And it led to him being killed. But as a 17-year-old, I came home for fall break, and that was my fall break, And gun violence is something that, like, it's always been around, right? But now in Philadelphia, for example, we have, on average, growing up, it was 300 murders a year. And so, like, you open up the paper and you just pray you don't know anyone. So this was probably the first one that, like, I knew the person. Like, we played on the same sports teams. Like, every Saturday we played basketball in the yard, right? So I think that was another education. In high school, for example, I went to Central High School, but one of the fascinating things about Central is they pull people from all over the city. So like for me then, diversity wasn't just like performative, right? Like they got a choice. I mean, they're saying we're taking 800 freshmen. So they pick whoever 800 they want. So you can look at quotas and all that stuff you want, but it was fascinating, right? So after I had adopted into what I would call African-American culture, I get to Central, and I remember my ninth grade orientation, I'm sitting next to a kid whose name I will say, Seth Goldberg, right? And now I had done some research. Central used to be all boys, all white, and a lot of rich Jewish families would send their kids there, right? So there's still like a very strong Jewish population that goes to Central. So I'm sitting next to Seth Goldberg. I know this is literally the home for rich Jewish boys, So I'm trying to make the connection. This is like, mid-90s, and we're talking. I was like, we should hang out, Like, there's 800 students. We're not going to know anyone in 3 months. We know each other. We should hang out. He's like, yeah, that'd be cool. I was like, we went to the malls back then. That's what you did. So even though he lived on the other side of the city, I was like, we should meet up at the mall or something, like on a Saturday. He goes, oh, yeah, no, I go to synagogue. And I was just like, you fly back to Jerusalem like every week to go to synagogue? Like I had no concept that there was Jewish people in Philadelphia, right? And because in my neighborhood, there were none that I knew of. The few white kids I knew in my neighborhood had assimilated into our culture. So I don't even know if they would say they're black, but they would definitely identify primarily with African-American culture because that's what they were swimming in than like any white kids I knew. So that was another education, right? Like getting a chance to, there's a really cool scene in Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. He talks about being on the lawn at his college and walking out and seeing blackness in so many different views, right? Like so many, like one of the lies that America tells us is that blackness is a monolith, right? There's only one way to be black. And for him, it was this revolution, like, oh my gosh, there's all these different forms of blackness. For me, I felt like Central expanded not only my blackness, but my understanding of people, understanding there's all forms of different people. It was just like, but it was like real in the sense of like, these are my relationships, right? So I think that was a pivotal point. And lastly, I would say like I went to Messiah College, right? And the joke for my group that was at Messiah College in the early 2000s was there was really 10 black people on campus. Now, if you look at the numbers, that's not true at all, right? But it was our joke because like we all knew each other, And then part of that was a survival thing, but I don't think we knew at the time it was a survival thing, right? So I think what's fascinating for me now, being almost over 16 years since I graduated, is to be able to see. So I have kids who I used to be in youth ministry who've now gone through Messiah, and one of our really daughters, good young lady, we die. My wife and I crack up because every time we see her in a picture, we're like, where are you getting all these black people? Like, we just don't understand. Because I kid you not, if you look at any of my pictures from early 2000s to 2004, you'll see my same rotation of 10, you know? And like every time she posts a new picture, we're like, where are they pulling all these people from, you know? So I think there is, there's growth that's happened. I think the voice has happened. One of the things about America that I think is important for people to realize is that, like, it's not just that we live in a racist, white supremacist society, is that that's very much the default, right? And most black people I know can answer this question very eloquently, or even if it's not eloquently, they have an experience. They don't have to search far. So for me, part of my tension point with police is I grew up in a neighborhood that was over-policed. You know, most white people when they grow up, if they're having a family picnic, you know, it'd be weird if the cops even drove around once, right? Most black people in my neighborhood in Southwest Philly, if we had a cookout, it'd be weird if we didn't see the cops 2 or 3 times, you know? And again, it doesn't mean that we're over criminals, but it's just like, if you're over policing, you know, it's the same thing. And if you look at criminologists, people who study crime, a lot of them tell you that it's, all the numbers are relatively the same, you know, like people committing or doing illegal acts is relatively the same, no matter your skin color, right? But the difference of over policing in some of the neighborhoods I grew up in is that, like, not just we get caught, but we get harassed, you know? And I think that's the thing. And so for me, one of the lessons I learned going to a predominantly white institution was that cops are supposed to protect and serve. I never knew that. Like, never occurred to me. Like, I know it's on your bumper sticker, but I grew up in Philadelphia, man. Like, we have a long history. Like, so a lot of the protesting that's happening now, people are knocking down Rizzo statues. And if you want to study Rizzo and his relationship with the black community in Philly, you'll see, like, oh my gosh, this is like literally 40 years overdue, right? I've yet to meet a black native Philadelphian who didn't celebrate Rizzo's statue going down. It doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter where they land on the protest. It doesn't matter where they land on rioting. It doesn't even matter where they land politically, spiritually, nothing. I've yet to meet any of us who grew up in Philadelphia who are like, this is a great day. You know, like I even had friends who were just like, I'm not into nonviolence, but if you're gonna be violent, or not even violent, if you're gonna destroy stuff, start with the Rizzo statue. I mean, and then the next day someone painted over, I mean, the South Philly was kind of where Rizzo held his power, right? And there's this huge mural that it's the closest I would say, honestly, is to black people in the South who grew up under the shadows of Confederate monuments, right? Like, it was like a stamp. It was just saying, like, this is my neighborhood. And even though I didn't come up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s when Rizzo was in power, I still feel the specter every time I went to South Philly. They painted over it. And people were, like, celebrating, right? So I think that, like, for me, and I went to middle school when I moved to Philadelphia in a neighborhood where the police literally dropped a bomb on citizens, right? Like, read about MOVE, right? We dropped a bomb on citizens, right? So I can tell you some of the systemic stuff, but personally, yeah, like going to Messiah and realizing that, like, you really think they're here to protect and serve you? This is fascinating. The best we could hope for was, like, having a detective who maybe lived in the neighborhood or coached one of your sports teams. So if someone you knew got in trouble, you could be like, hey, Detective Josiah, that guy, he's good. You know, he's good peoples. Like, you wouldn't even say good police, you say he's good peoples. Like, and out of like maybe 20, 40 in that district, you knew you at least had one person who at least give you a fair share, right? But personally, man, I faced stuff, even here in Harrisburg. When I first moved to Harrisburg, I had housemates, and there was 4 of us in the house. Our laundry was actually on the 2nd floor. And I say that because I lived on the 3rd floor. And I remember, like, I came down to change laundry and I heard pounding at my door. And first of all, this is on Green Street in the heart of Harrisburg's gentrification. Like, the heart, I mean, they even changed the neighborhood and created a new neighborhood of Old Uptown, right? So, like, not to excuse that, like, oh, I'm not on Allison Hill. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that, like, this stuff finds you wherever you are, right? So I come downstairs and I see 4 police officers on my porch. At this time, I wasn't married. Like, I had housemates. I was home alone doing laundry. And literally, I looked at them. I was just like, hello? They're like, hey, can we come in? And I was just like, no, and that's part of my training and upbringing and the talks I got from older African Americans, older Black people, is just like, you're not gonna let 4 police into your house, like without anyone else to see and only them, like you're just not gonna do it. So I was just like, no. And they're like, well, we have a call in for domestic abuse. And at the time, my understanding of domestic abuse was like marriage, or like a living girlfriend. I was like, well, that's impossible because I'm not married. They're like, well, this is the address they gave us. I was like, no, you can't come in. I don't know if I had been listening to too much Jay-Z, right? Like I was just like, you can't touch my house. You can't come in. You can't do none of that, right? And literally a cop, one of the cops, and this is years ago, so I didn't get badge numbers or anything, because again, that's why I said earlier, like with America, you'll get plenty of other opportunities. Like in this moment, I just didn't know what all to do except to not allow them in. And a cop literally reached for his gun. I was just like, are you sure? And I was just like, well, if you do that now, I'm sure, you're definitely not coming in, right? And I don't know where the boldness came from. It was probably just a survival mentality, survival mindset. And what happened, though, is that the cop then literally, like, one of their walkie-talkies went off, and they're like, hey, are you at 1918? And they said a different street number. And all 5 of us knew, oh my goodness, you're at the wrong house, right? And they literally looked at each other and then just turned around and go into their cars and went to the house where the issue was happening without an apology, without, hey, we messed up, and that stuff stays in your mind, right? It's just like, I didn't allow you in, and maybe that was just a tick. Maybe he was just putting his hand on his hip. But the fact that, like, I felt like, as a citizen, you were reaching for your gun to try and intimidate me to enter my house where it's 4-on-1, that was some of the things. Then there's been other stuff, too. Like, I feel like every 2 to 3 years, I started being friends with Chief Carter. So, like, at least in the city, I'm okay somewhat, But every 2 to 3 years, I call a driving while black ticket, Like, it's a legit thing. My favorite one was when I was in seminary, studying about the good Lord, how to help the people, It was in a pretty rural area, and I remember driving to class. It was a night class, and it was a back road that could get you to, first of all, my seminary is in Myerstown, which is not a bustling metropolis, so everything to get there is a back road, so I gotta say that. But I'm on a very back road, like a special back road, and, I got this overwhelming sense of, like, you're gonna be okay. And I was just like, thank you, Holy Spirit, but I feel fine, And as soon as I said I feel fine, my car slid on some black ice, right? Spun out, and literally you sit on the top left or the front left of your car, and it was the back right of my car literally smacked into a telephone pole and crunched in. So literally, like, the polar opposite of where I was sitting was what got crushed in, right? And I remember sitting there like, oh, I guess I will be fine, like it was relief, after you get over the whole getting your breath back, right? I called my insurance guy, and he's like, hey, you got to call the police. I was like, I just don't think this is a good idea, And he's like, no, it'll be fine. I'm filing the paperwork now. Everything will be good. I was like, yeah, but I'm in the middle of nowhere, very rural. Like, I don't see any black people anywhere, And I just feel like you should make the call and you should handle it. Like, I'll be here, but I think you should be the first point. And he was like, no, Hank, it'll be fine. So then I call, I waited an hour for the police to actually get there. I was facing oncoming traffic in black ice. So all I did was I kind of like prayed and got the car off the side of the road, right? And waited again an hour. The police gets there, he does his investigation, he goes through everything. He's like, hey, where are you going? Which I interpret as like, what are you doing here, And I'm just like, just stay calm, it's not a big deal. Like, I can literally see my seminary, it's a mile down the road, right? So I was like, oh, I'm going to night class at seminary. He goes, oh, you're a pastor. And I was just like, man, this will be good because I'm a pastor, Like, this will get me in there, that area of Pennsylvania is even more of a Bible belt. So I was just like, oh, they're going to give me some respect. I'm a pastor, right? My naivety kind of kicked in. And I was just like, yeah, I'm doing this and blah, blah, blah. He goes, okay, then you'll understand. And I was just like, I don't know where this is going, He goes, Romans 13, man, And so that's actually, he didn't know this, but that's literally one of my pet peeves. There's a lot of people who use that verse that I think, or that passage that I think that, the writer, like Paul's not necessarily writing that you should submit to the authorities. Like, this is the guy who was beaten, chained. Basically, that he was a Roman citizen is the only reason he survived, right? Paul's not the most ardent God in Rome person. He's not. Like, there's no way you can look at his life and everything he's suffered under Rome and he's saying that, like, I want you to respect Rome. That's not what he's talking about, right? To me, that's the equivalent of asking even like a Martin Luther King, but like, do you trust America? You know, like I think you should always trust America. And then you read the rest of Dr. King's speeches and you're like, I don't know if this matches up, right? But I think that's what we're doing to Paul. So again, that's my personal pet peeve, but now it was being used to say like, I'm authority and you have to respect authority. And I'm sitting here like, what am I respecting authority on with your bad translation or your bad interpretation, your bad exegesis, you know? And he gave me a ticket. And the ticket was literally for fleeing the scene. And I remember getting it, like, how is this even possible? Like, first of all, I moved my car off the road from oncoming traffic and ice, right? So maybe I moved my car, but I'm like, that's what you're supposed to do. And then I stayed with the car for over an hour waiting for you. Like, I'm sitting in the same car. How did I flee the scene, right? But I got a ticket for fleeing the scene. I usually, when I get tickets, it's just like, it's not points on my license or whatever. I'll just like pay it. It's not worth it, right? But this one, I'm like, yo, if they get me for destruction of public property or fleeing the scene, like I get points on my license. I'm gonna fight it, right? So the address he gave me was in Lebanon County. I showed up an hour early, which if you know me, that's really impressive. Like, I am very African in this, or not even African, non-Western, because the rest of the world is how we operate. It's not just the black folk in Africa. The rest of the world don't follow Western timestamps, right? So time for me is relative, you know? But I show up an hour early. I get to the courtroom, and I show the lady the letter I got. She goes, oh yeah, you're good, just sit right there. 15 minutes go by, I can see the courtroom, nothing's happening. 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. I'm like, hey, the judge coming down? Are they gonna come get me? She goes, yeah. 5 minutes to go, I go up again. I was just like, hey, like, there's literally no one in that courtroom. Did I just go and sit in and wait? And she goes, oh, wait, let me see your letter again. And she goes, oh, you were here for fleeing the scene. Yeah, this is the wrong courtroom. And I was just like, are you kidding me right now? So what's the right one? She goes, oh, it's on the other side of town. And I'm like, literally, you gave me the address. You read the letter an hour ago. You sat there and watched me literally sit in your little not even cubicle, like your waiting area where it was only me and you for 55 minutes. And it just dawned upon you that if this is what I'm here for, this is the wrong thing. So obviously I get in my car, try not to get a speeding ticket, I race across town, and they're like, oh, you're 5 minutes late. I explain it, and they're like, well, we don't really, sorry, but that's just an excuse. And I was just like, but you don't understand, right? Like, you literally don't understand. You gave me the address. I sat there. You can call the lady. And they go, well, you can apply for a new date. And I was like, well, how much does that cost, right? So I had to pay X amount of money. I think it was like, they had reduced it to $200 ticket, but I had to pay like $160 just to get another trial, to get dismissed. And they said, well, once you pay that $160 for another trial, it's not, even if it gets dismissed, like the most you can get is $40 back, you know? And you're probably not gonna get that because they'll probably charge you court fees, so you'll probably owe some more. So I'm just like, this is the system we're operating in. For the most part, I am a black man who I would consider an upstanding citizen, you know, who hasn't been arrested or any of that. Not that that's an excuse to treat me poorly, but even I'm not protected, right? So that's some of the personal experiences. I mean, there's a couple more, but that's just a few of them. I think things can change, man. I think one of the things I keep trying to tell myself is, how do I have a long view in this? You know, like I think that one of the things I've been impressed with, I think there's more people who are actually in the fight now. But one of the things I'm realizing is, for the people, do your work, right? Do your work to know how you can grow, right? I can tell you what books to read, who to follow, what institutions to go out and support. Like, there's a lot of that information you can just Google. You can literally Google how to be an anti-racist or how to fight for racial justice. Like, I can fill your head, right? But I can also tell you organizations to join. I can literally like give you boots on the ground that you can go join in. There's marches all over the place, right? We can do that too. But I think for the mass of people, for us to get real change and sustainable change, we gotta actually do some hard work. And what I mean by that is, it's gotta be about relationships. Because here's the thing, like, you don't really care until you care, you know? So the example I've been using is, you know, my first car I really loved was a blue Toyota. Now, I'm sure there were blue Toyotas that existed before, and I'm sure there's blue Toyotas that existed after, right? But what happens when I start driving a blue Toyota? I notice what? Every single blue Toyota on the street, even to this day. And I think that's the same thing when it comes to relationships. Like when you are intertwined with people, walking with people who love you and you love them, like their concerns, their struggles become things that you're just way more invested in, right? So I think that's one of the things for the masses, right? Like we have a lot of information going out that's filling people's head, which is great because we're Western, right? We have a lot of information, which is, especially in this area, getting people on the ground, which is great because we're practical people, but we can't lose the heart. We can't lose the relationship. The second thing I think that's really, really important in all this too, though, is to realize that like, this has to be a sustainable moment, right? There's got to be more voices fighting on different lines, right? So there's a lot of people right now who are for the first time asking, well, how does our police department spend money? You know, like what is the accountability? And I think part of the work is figuring out what groups are already on the ground doing this work. You know, don't assume, right? So I think a lot of times people assume that we in our communities aren't fighting these fights, or we in our community aren't doing these things. So I think like, find out who's doing what and go jump in. I think that's important. But then just realize that like, this is a long, long road. You know, like you're gonna need perseverance, but you're gonna need people who love you, who value you. And I think maybe the third thing is, you know, find voices that challenge you. Right? So it's not just this like existential exercise or this academic exercise of like, oh, I identify this, so I'm gonna find someone on the polar opposite, right? No, find people who don't just challenge you, but people who are gonna grow you. You know, and I think there's a lot of really, really good that can happen on all this. On my most hopeful days, I see this as a watershed moment, you know? On every other day, which is every day that ends in day, I say this is still America, you know, and this is still a system that, you know, we just changed the tool of racism. Like every couple of years, you know, we just changed the primary vehicle, right? So I think we need to be mindful of what does hope look like. So even when we ask that question, like what makes you hopeful? For me, it's honestly relationships. Like if people get in relationship with each other, then I think they're gonna be more willing to fight for one another. I think there's a lot of really cool institutions doing good work, but if I'm not in relationship with those people on the ground, right, it's gonna be a $30 donation and I'm good, right? Or it's gonna be like, I marched, so I'm good, I got my check mark. So yeah, so I would say be in relationship, challenge yourself to grow, face the history, and realize that, you know, I think King was right on this too, like there's another America, right? There's an America that you may not necessarily see or understand, but that people live. And how do we not just elevate those experiences, but also realize that that's the reality of America too? And then how do we fight to change some of that?